Exile, do something!
Returned tenfold. Space aligns. 1,000 suns. Incineration. The fires of
Hey there, I just want to do a quick little build showcase for the build that my Pathfinder will be until the end of the league or until I quit. It is worth noting that this is not a build guide. I will not be telling you all of the different intricacies of the build. I just want to show off the build, what it can do, and sort of how it lives, how it does. The core skill is, of course, everyone's favorite Penance Brand. This skill is just stupidly good for doing damage without investing a ton into the actual skill itself. So you can see that most of our gear here is actually defensive, except for a few things like Ming's Heart. And because of that, we're able to achieve pretty incredible defensiveness. And to highlight some of the important defensive layers here, if we look at POB, one of the first things I want to highlight is full Phys to Elemental conversion without the use of Taste of Hate. You'll see that my sources here are the Lightning Coil for 50, a Purity of Elements Watcher's Eye for 12, a Dawnbreaker for 20. Note that you can actually get a taken as implicit on here if you want to, but it's just incredibly expensive. You can get it on your helmet. I have it crafted on the helmet. You can also get it as an implicit if you go for a little bit of a less min-maxy version where you don't run Purity or Herald of Purity. If you don't run Herald of Purity, you can get it on the Eldritch implicit as well as a different source of taken as. The other sources are from a Lethal Pride. Here you can see this Lethal Pride. There's 5% here and 5% here. This setup is pretty tight. It is exactly 100% with several max rolled things. And so like a max roll Dawnbreaker, a max roll Purity of Elements Watcher Eye, and max roll on the helmet craft. You can see it rolls 7 to 8, so you have to recraft that a couple times. And other than that, this build uses Bloodnotch. Here, this is a max roll Bloodnotch, which is ideal. The higher you can get, the better. I recommend just using Defiance of Destiny if you're not able to get a Bloodnotch of at least 58%. Defiance of Destiny might also just be better, but it basically requires you to drop Purity or Herald of Clarity, because Replica Dragonflaying does provide 10% RMR, which is super good for how tight our mana costs are. You can say I only have 68 left here in the bottom right. And if you're not aware of what Bloodnotch is a setup where you use Immutable Force to mitigate stuns, because Bloodnotch requires you to get stunned to get the recovery. Use Immutable Force to negate the sort of micro stun, or make it into a micro stun. The higher the number, the better. I would highly recommend only buying it at least 961%, I believe is the appropriate number. And then you need an ES mastery for changing your stun threshold to be based on your ES. And then you need to keep your ES low. So for example, you can see that I have 43. You can alternatively use Eldritch Battery if you have more than that. I do not I recommend keeping this like under 100 active. Keeping it super close to 43 is really good. Avoid getting ES on your gear where possible, and avoid getting ES on your cluster jewels where possible. The lower you are, the better chance that you don't grief your Bloodnotch. Going past that, this build uses a 21 vitality to help offset some of the regen problems that can happen from degens or a progenesis that is getting overloaded. And then this build also gets 90 all res. You can see in my character sheet in game that I actually properly do have 90 all res. The sources that give this are the Purity of Elements gives +7. If we can look here, it's a little bit hard to like kind of decipher this, but boots have an Eldritch implicit. If I move this slightly over so you can see both. Boots have an Eldritch implicit for +2 max res. This is an exquisite, so you do need to Orb of Conflict it. As other sources are that which was taken for a +2. 2 charms that give +2. The third charm is not a +2 because that is our source of frenzy charge. And then you have a Purity of Ire, which I believe I already mentioned, for +7. Melding of the Fletch chunks it down a little bit. And then we have a setup with an Impossible Escape to get +1, +2, using about Unwavering Stance. You could also use Balance Guard to get +1, +2, but it is substantially more expensive. And it's just not worth it when you can use Unwavering Stance to get the same result. The last important notable thing for defensiveness is using all 3 elemental flasks with max roll increase effect. Pathfinder in my setup gets 160% increased flask effect, which means the 20% less cold damage taken here turns into about 52% less cold damage taken, bringing us to an effective like 95 all res. Now on to a little bit about the offensive layers of this build. Firstly is the wand. You want a double +1 wand, ideally with some combination of dot multi, crafted chaos dot multi, cast speed, just those sort of like chaos offensive, like damage over time modifiers. Cast speed is also stupidly good because Penance Brand scales really well with cast speed. And it's worth noting that this build, I currently have an Original Sin. You do not need this ring. This is not even an offensive upgrade necessarily. If you can't afford an Original Sin, you just run a self-cast Despair somewhere in the build, and you just run a second Ming's Heart. It does not matter. The Original Sin is basically just a defensive upgrade because you don't have to deal with the 25% reduced maximum life that the Ming's Heart gives. Running a replica Dragonflame's Flight is also a ton of damage. It also gives you some RMR, which is nice for getting all of your auras in, especially if you're trying to run Herald of Purity. It is worth noting that you should not try to divine your RMR if you have a Penance Brand without a max roll RMR, because divining a replica's Dragonflight's Flang, whatever I don't know how to pronounce that, but divining this item will change the gem type. You see, if you hold alt, you can see that the Penance Brand there is actually a roll. Do not divine a replica Dragonfang's Flight. Be very careful with that. The shield is defensive. The helmet is almost entirely defensive, other than the Eldritch Implicits. Lightning Coil is defensive. Asenath's Touch is just a standard way of getting easy temp chains. Getting a +1 max Frenzy Corrupted Implicit is also stupidly easy, because the Asenath enchants without corruption are all over the place. So just getting a single Corrupted Implicit. If you want a double Corrupted Implicit, that is where it gets a little bit expensive. Mageblood, basically mandatory. If you can't afford a Mageblood, I wouldn't bother trying to make the bossing version of this build yet. I would just kind of stay as the MFing version of the build and just kind of farm up a bunch of money. And then the boots are also primarily defensive. They have Essenced Int, because depending on what base you use to craft, you might need a lot of Int. Like I used a Profane Wand, which is a base of 237 Int, so I required the huge chunk of Int that Stealth Boots provide. It's also worth noting that a Replica Dragonfang's Flight has reduced attribute requirements on it, which is a low-key great aspect of this item because it helps lower the requirements if you have a high int base wand and also the 160 strength that Dawnbreaker requires. And yeah, that's kind of a basic overview of the items that give offensive bonuses. The other thing is, so I'm running Withering Step. You only need to run Withering Step if you are using Original Sin. This is because if you're not running an Original Sin, you will be self-casting Despair, and what you'll actually end up doing is running a Balance of Terror that has a, when you cast Despair, inflict Withered on hit for 2 seconds with hits. And that sort of sustains Wither on its own, so you don't need Withering Step. I'm running Withering Step because Penance Brand does not hit enough for the Pathfinder Ascendancy, this one here, Nature's Reprisal, to sustain it on its own. So it needs the additional Withering stacks to keep up like max Wither on like bossing time. Otherwise, most of these links are auras, aura. This is a defensive Mortal Call setup. This is mobility. And then in my boots, although it doesn't have to be your boots, but I'm putting it in my boots, I have a Divine Blessing Haste. This is just a huge amount of damage as well, and you use it as a Divine Blessing because this thing requires too much RMR to reserve with your setup. And it's important to note that I actually don't have a mana cost of this. This is because you run Inspiration. You can do this as a 39% reduced mana cost, and that stacks with the crafted mana cost Flask mod. Now, because I have amplified Flask effect of 160, 159 on this one %, this plus Inspiration equate to 100% reduced mana cost for Haste. This means I'm actually able to cast Haste non-stop, and effectively lets me get 100% uptime on Haste without ever having to like spend mana, which is the main downside of Divine Blessing, or having to reserve it yourself, like with your own mana. And that basically goes over the gem offensives, and I think that covers all of the offensive layers that are notably in like changeable, not including anything on the tree. You can note the tree or any of that stuff. There'll be a POV in the description if you want to inspect it a bit. I also wanted to make one quick note on poison chance. So this version of the build uses Septic Spell Chaos Dot clusters to get poison chance cap. It's worth noting that 40% of your poison chance will come from 2 Septic Spell clusters. You can actually make it more if you want, but like the other easily accessible poison chance nodes on the tree, for example, this one here, or this one here, and this one here, are relatively accessible without losing much damage. So you don't really need a third cluster with Septic Spells, although you could if you wanted to mix things up a little bit. But that is just an important note that these medium clusters are super important. Do not overlook them. You need them. But yeah, that's all I really wanted to add here. This isn't a build guide. This is kind of showcasing what this build can do and a few of the important core aspects of it. If you want to try it out for yourself, just take a look at the POB. Anyone who's playing at this point and has the money to invest in this build probably can figure out how this build works. It's pretty simple. It's kind of just Penance Brand plus poison plus a bunch of items. But yeah, this build is stupidly good at farming Ubers. It doesn't kill them instantly, but it's relatively safe. Not many things can kill you in Ubers, even if you do yellow Uber Exarchs and Eaters, or if you just if you're not good at actually dodging mechanics. It's also really, really good at farming T17 maps. I've personally been buying up and running a ton of the foiled Mageblood maps because this build is capable of running a lot of them. Not a ton, not all of them, but they're able to run a lot of them, and it's just free money. You can run Magebloods. I also run Fulcrums. You can do Progenesis ones depending on the price. It's just very, very important to not run void maps because this build can still die. This build has its weaknesses as not a void map runner. Keep that in mind. You probably will die if you try to run void maps. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Figure out what mods are things that you can't do or are not comfortable doing, and just look for the maps that don't have that. And you should have a pretty easy time because it's super easy. This build just tanks absolutely everything. And yeah, have a good one.